BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nedheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays, I talk to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery. And in this episode, I will be looking at John Douglas's analysis of the From Hell letter, revisiting Francis Tumblety as a Jack the Ripper suspect, and responding to the challenge questions from the Ripper cast. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about Jack the Ripper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. The first thing I would like to do is give a shout out to Harry Horn, who said, "One of the best analyses of the From Hell letter is by retired FBI agent John Douglas in his book, The Cases That Haunt Us. It is an excellent read." And just yesterday on the channel, I was telling you guys that I'm going to be talking a lot more about John Douglas and his books, and I've read The Cases That Haunt Us in the past, and I even did a standalone episode about it here on Black Box Online Radio last year, but I wanted to go and pick it up again, because I wanted to focus very specifically on this section that is related to the From Hell letter, based on the recommendation from Harry Horn here. And as you see, this is something that was recommended by one of the listeners. If you have any ideas for future episodes of BBO War, you can drop them in the comment section down below, or of course blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And when I was reading through John Douglas's section on the cases that haunt us, in the cases that haunt us about the From Hell letter, he made some very bold statements. The first is, he seems to differentiate the From Hell letter from Jack the Ripper's other communications. And let's just look at the build-up to this. At this point, Jack the Ripper has firstly murdered two women before any of the letters start, Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman, who are murdered on August 31st and September 8th of 1888, respectively. Then there's the From Hell letter that comes on September 27th of 1888, and then there is the double event where two women are murdered in one night, Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes. Following that, there is the Saucy Jackie postcard, and John Douglas states very clearly in his book that he does not believe that those letters came from the killer, for the following reason. He thinks that the language and verbiage is just completely different. It's almost too friendly. It's almost lighthearted and silly. They say I'm a doctor now, ha ha. My knife is so nice and sharp. Oh, I put some blood in a jar, but it turned thick like glue. Red ink will have to do. He was just like, this doesn't seem to match any of the actions and activities of Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper was a serial killer who murdered and mutilated women and cut out their organs. And those are the things that John Douglas is going to focus on more. John Douglas was also of the opinion that Jack the Ripper was not a medical doctor, and I hope that I can get the exact phrasing right from the book. Jack the Ripper was somebody who might not have been a medical doctor, but he had a perverse curiosity about organs and the human body and human anatomy. So that is where John Douglas is leading. But with the From Hell letter, he thought that this did indeed tie in well with somebody who would have this type of perverted curiosity about the human body, because the From Hell letter is accompanied by half a kidney that is in a type of alcoholic solution. And, I mean, in the past, like, I've talked about how there are a lot of, like, different debates. One of them, I mean, like, in the cases that haunt us, it openly states that the kidney was preserved in wine, but in other sources, it just states that it was preserved in some type of alcoholic spirit. And on a previous episode of Ripper Wednesday, I was even hypothesizing that maybe it was wood alcohol, which was used in medical preservations. But one of you guys in the comments section said that medical students at the time would have access to organs that would not be preserved in alcohol. They would be preserved in formaldehyde, even back in 1888. So I'm just going to go with that, and I just have a little bit of trouble accepting that it was preserved in wine. Maybe some harder type of alcohol would make just a little bit more sense to me, but we could be dealing with a very deranged person. Anybody who sends half a kidney in, whether it's an authentic one or it's not authentic, they're a little bit messed up in the head, if I can be very frank. But Jack the Ripper is somebody who did mutilate the women's bodies. And with the fourth victim, Catherine Eddowes, her kidney was taken as well as her uterus. in the From Hell letter states that there was this direct intention to mail in half the kidney because the killer ate the other half, fried and ate it. In fact, I'm just going to read the text of the From Hell letter right here. From Hell, Mr. Lusk, sore. I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you together. T'other meaning the other. T'other piece I fried and ate it. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if you only wait while longer. Signed, catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk. And as you already heard there are a lot of misspellings. And this is part of the book, The Cases That Haunt Us, that became rather confusing, because John Douglas is just putting all of the options on the table, even ones that he doesn't agree with. I get accused of this all the time on Black Box Online Radio, saying, well, you said this, but you also said that. How could all of these things be true? Well, I wasn't saying that all of them were true. And if you read this book and the From Hell letter section in The Cases That Haunt Us, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. He's just listing off several different possibilities. So what do we make of this language that is used in the From Hell letter? Compare it to, my knife's so nice and sharp, they say I'm a doctor now, ha. I put blood in a ginger beer bottle, but it turned thick like glue. What do we make of this? Because with the first two letters, it really does seem like the person has a very strong command of the English language. I've even said that I just think the person who wrote them was not only fluent in English, but educated in the English language, and you might even go as far as to say that they were an Englishman, as opposed to somebody who was an immigrant, with the exception of someone who learned English at a very young age, fluent and educated in English. With the Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jackie postcard, the From Hell letter is filled with mistakes, errors, and just bizarre arrangements. For example, From Hell, Mr. Lusk, sir, it's spelled S-O-R, but most likely that's the word sir. I send you half a kidney. Kidney is spelled K-I-D-N-E. I took one from the woman, preserved it. Preserved is misspelled. T'other piece I fried, meaning the other, but it's spelled T-O-T-H-E-R, and ate it. Very nice. I may send you the bloody knife. Knife is misspelled, missing an E. If you only wait a while longer. Wait and while are misspelled. Catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk. It doesn't even spell the word Mr. correctly. So, one possibility is that this was indeed a native English speaker. I mean, this is per John Douglas in his book, The Cases That Haunt Us. This could have been a native English speaker who was from Ireland, who was not very well literate, and he was just writing things in a colloquial way. The second possibility is this was the same author as the first two communications, but he decided to pretend to be a little bit more working class, that this is an educated person trying to tone down his language. And the third is that this is somebody who was an immigrant from a country, let's say somewhere in Eastern Europe, and he actually didn't speak English well, and he did not write English with correct spellings and correct grammar. Is there one that you're leaning toward right now? Is there one that you're leaning to right now? Do you have any ideas? What sounds the best to you? Now, at first, John Douglas is actually going to be going to the latter one, that this is somebody who does not speak English well. He almost even called this a perverse imitation of the previous two communications, where somebody might be trying to write the letter in somewhat of a calligraphic way, almost trying to show some type of elegance, the way that the Dear Boss letter has its own elegance. He's trying to elongate certain lines and make it look a little bit fancy, even though he can barely write the English language. A key motivation for this would be that, alright, so there is a Whitechapel murderer, and this person has murdered 4 people at that point. Liz Stride, Catherine Eddowes, let's start at the beginning. Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, and Catherine Eddowes. Maybe 5 if we include Martha Tabram. And then somebody else starts pretending to be him by mailing the letters to the Central News Agency. So this person is thinking, you know what? If somebody's going to pretend to be me, then I'm going to write my own letter. And there is almost no way that Jack the Ripper would not have known about how people are putting his name into the paper. The real Whitechapel murderer, no matter whom he was, most likely knew that there was this newspaper media frenzy going around where the killer is being called Jack the Ripper. So this guy's thinking, you know what, I'm going to write my own letter, and I'm going to include half of a kidney to prove that I was the real killer. And as far as the authenticity of the kidney goes, what John Douglas says in the book The Cases That Haunt Us is very simple. He's just like, the authenticity of the kidney has never been disproven. Now, he does share some quotations from Dr. Thomas Openshaw about how it came from somebody who was a female in the mid-40s, who was an alcoholic and had Bright's disease, which should match up perfectly with Catherine Eddowes. But what John Douglas did not include in the book is Thomas Openshaw, as I understand, went on the record saying, hey, wait a second. I know that these quotations have been attributed to me, but the newspapers grossly misinterpreted what I was saying. All he really meant to convey is that it was from an adult human kidney, and I think that that is way more accurate. But, John Douglas gave an honest statement in the book. The authenticity of the kidney has never been proven or disproven, and I don't think that that is just some type of, halfway in, halfway out statement. It's being honest. It's not just someone like who's on the fence and afraid to take a strong stance. It's just looking at the facts that the real kidney no longer exists. We can't examine it and do DNA testing on it, but it's never been disproven. So there is a chance, and there's a reasonable chance that the kidney actually did come from the victim. If you were to ask me on a personal level, 2 years ago, what did I think about the Jack the Ripper letters? I would have said that they were all hoaxes. And except the one that had the highest chance of being an authentic communication was the From Hell letter. And that's pretty much what you would find in the book, The Cases That Haunt Us. If you were to ask me a year ago, I would have told you, I don't know. I simply don't know. I have no idea at all. And if you were to tell me now, I would still say the From Hell letter has a very high chance of being authentic, but also the Dear Boss letter has gone way up in my book, and then that could easily be explained about how somebody wrote two letters, and then they're pretending to they're intentionally trying to tone down their language or pretending to write in a different style. And another one could also be that the Ripper was actually losing control of his mental faculties. That's another possibility that's discussed in the book The Cases That Haunt Us. But you guys who know Ripper Wednesday, you guys who follow Ripper Wednesday, know that I am of the strong standpoint that I still say that all of the letters are hoaxes, but I could easily be proven wrong about that. And I guess you'd say that over time, I've given a lot more consideration to how the letters could have been authentic. But ultimately, it seems like John Douglas is taking the stance of how the letters are most likely hoaxes, except the From Hell letter has a very high chance of being authentic. Now, why would he do this? Why would Jack the Ripper do this? Well, one reason that's laid out very clearly in the book The Cases That Haunt Us is John Douglas does not believe that there would have been any real benefit to the killer for mailing in letters after the murders of Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman. Because, I'm going to paraphrase some things. What is Jack the Ripper's motivation? To mutilate women. What does Jack the Ripper care about? Mutilating women. As evidenced by the double event when Liz Stride is attacked, but she is not mutilated. So the Ripper then has to go to Mitre Square and find another victim with the opportunity to mutilate her. It's almost as if he's getting some type of exhilaration from mutilating the women, as opposed to simply committing murder. But mailing in letters has nothing to do with that. It's possible to mutilate women without mailing in letters. But when we look at Jack the Ripper in contrast to the Zodiac killer of the 1960s, of course, all things Jack the Ripper and Zodiac, I do comparisons all the time. What is the true motivation of the Zodiac from the 1960s? To create the Zodiac killer persona, to write letters, and to spread the image of terror around Northern California and perhaps the nation and the world. But that's what the Zodiac wanted to do. He wanted to create the image of terror. Jarrett Kobeck even called it the initial spark. Committing the murders were the initial spark, or the essential spark. I think it's called the essential spark, actually, that allowed this person to get mentioned in the paper, and his name and persona, the Zodiac, were mentioned in the paper, and it was just terrifying people. Was Jack the Ripper all about that? No, I do agree that Jack the Ripper's key motivation was to mutilate the women. And this is where John Douglas also looks at another psychological possibility, and that is that the Ripper might not have been a medical doctor, but he was somebody who had a perverse curiosity about organs, cutting out the uterus organ of Annie Chapman, with Catherine Eddowes taking her kidney and her uterus, and then with Mary Kelly, of course, taking her heart. So this might not have been the actions and activities of a medical doctor, but somebody who had some type of education with anatomy, an understanding of anatomy, but more importantly, a curiosity about it, a perverted or perverse curiosity about the anatomical features of the human body, a perverted or perverse curiosity about organs. So that stuff I can follow. Now, he might think that the From Hell letter has a higher chance of being authentic than I do, but I mean, I really am just open to the possibility. Let's be clear about that. So, what do you really think, though, about the letters? Do you think that they were authentic? What do you think about this statement that Jack the Ripper was not a medical doctor and that he was somebody who would have had education and an understanding of anatomy to a certain extent, but the primary reason why these organs are taking is because of a perverted curiosity. And John Douglas will ultimately settle on the Jack the Ripper suspect, Aaron Kosminski, the way that many people do. So he is, of course, thinking about somebody who is not a medical doctor. Kosminski was a barber and hairdresser, but he would have known a little bit about anatomy, but it's more done for, as we said, the perverse curiosity partnered with this exhilaration that comes from mutilating women. What do you think about that? And I would also like to move on to the next segment here on Ripper Wednesday, and I told you guys that I would be talking more about the suspect, Francis Tumblety. And the reason why is because I saw that there was a book written by Tony McMahon called Jack the Ripper and Abraham Lincoln. One man links the two greatest crimes of the 19th century. And even without reading a description, I knew that this was going to be going into the world of Francis Tumblety. That was one of the first things that stood out to me when I did my first Francis Tumblety episode 2 years ago. And I was like, okay, well, there's this Jack the Ripper, Abraham Lincoln connection. I'm going to have to explore that more in the future. And I'm just going to read the description for you real fast. An astonishing connection between two of the 19th century's greatest crimes. A fraudulent Dr. Francis Tumblety is implicated in both the 1865 assassination of President Abraham Lincoln and the 1888 Jack the Ripper killings. It seems that Jack the Ripper could have been involved in killing President Lincoln, but the evidence is revealed in this book. We delve into the murky underworld in America's Gilded Age and the poverty-ridden slums of Whitechapel, following the murderous trail left by Tumblety, a flamboyant huckster well known in the newspaper gossip columns, whose celebrity masked his homicidal tendencies. Arrested over the Lincoln assassination, then released, while others were hanged on the scaffold, put behind bars briefly by Scotland over the Jack the Ripper killings, but then makes a daring escape. The proof is overwhelming that Tumblety was one of the most dangerous criminals of the 19th century. And I really have to thank Tony McMahon for that. That is one powerful book description, and I am so tempted to read that, even though I cannot confess that I'm going to like what I find, because when I first looked into Francis Tumblety as a Jack the Ripper suspect, I was like, okay, this guy was definitely a criminal to a certain extent. I wasn't convinced at all that he was Jack the Ripper. When I began watching some of those, you guys are going to laugh at me, but History Channel documentaries, I began to see some of their points in favor of Francis Tumblety being Jack the Ripper, like this connection with the From Hell letter, about how the similarities in Francis Tumblety's handwriting and the From Hell letter are a little bit stronger than perhaps I gave them credit for, partnered with this type of a little bit of anatomical understanding, but maybe not a full-fledged medical doctor, but still having some type of perverted impulses. I think that stuff does match up. So he goes up maybe one notch higher in my book, from the bottom of the barrel to just above the bottom of the barrel, to be very frank and to be very honest. But I told you guys that I would respond to the challenge questions from the Ripper cast, and they actually had a guest on the program named Stan Russo, and the Ripper cast is an older program, and the backlog of it has been uploaded to YouTube, and Stan Russo was a guest there. He was the author of the book, The Jack the Ripper Suspects, Persons Cited by Investigators and Theorists. And, I mean, some of these, I thought, were pretty good. And the first challenge question was, if someone is a newcomer to the Jack the Ripper case, should they try to eliminate established suspects, or should they try and create their own unified theory? Wow, what a great question. If somebody is a newcomer to the Jack the Ripper case, should they try to eliminate suspects or create their own unified theory? I think absolutely try to eliminate the established suspects. Jumping into a complicated mystery like Jack the Ripper and just trying to start your own unified theory on day one, again, this is for newcomers, on day one, is perhaps going to be jumping into the deep end when you don't know how to swim. Learning more about the established suspects and the investigators who were looking into them, to the documents that are connecting these suspects to the Jack the Ripper case. It is a great way to familiarize oneself with the facts of the Ripper mystery. Furthermore, you might actually encounter something that was overlooked. You might just even get an understanding to your own satisfaction about how this person should not be taken seriously as a Jack the Ripper suspect. You also might find out that some suspects have been eliminated, and then they're just still in these contemporary discussions for impractical reasons. Absolutely, I think that you should do the first one there, eliminate established suspects. I'm going to share another reason why. Every Monday I do an episode about the Zodiac killer, and I was just telling you guys that I'm going to be pulling the Zodiac into this episode a lot. But I played a clip from the show Friday Beers, and these guys were talking about the Zodiac case. They do a general true crime and unsolved mystery discussion, and they were presented with the suspects and the letters and all of the facts of the Zodiac case. But they are newcomers, exactly what this question is talking about. And one of them was just going gung-ho for the prime suspect, Arthur Lee Allen, and the other one was formulating his own set of observations. And he's looking at how the Zodiac misspelled the word Christmas with two S's. He's like, wait, the SS, those are the Nazis, right? And then he looks at a photo of the Zodiac wearing the Lake Berryessa hooded costume. There are no photos. The composite drawing, the illustration of the Zodiac wearing the Lake Berryessa costume. And he's like, that looks like a Ku Klux Klan hood. I think we're dealing with some type of KKK Nazi guy. One guy is attaching himself to the prime suspect. One guy is pattern seeking to get a desired result. Both of these approaches are fundamentally wrong. Just because an idea is popular, it doesn't mean it's right. I mean that in all seriousness, especially in the true crime world, more so than perhaps any other discipline out there. Just because it's the most popular theory, it doesn't mean that this person actually was the killer. We can talk about Aaron Kosminski until the cows come home. It doesn't mean that he was actually Jack the Ripper. We can talk about Francis Tumblety as well, another very widely discussed suspect. It does not mean that he was Jack the Ripper. Just because a true crime theory is popular, it does not mean that this person was the killer. These are unsolved cases for a reason. But this whole thing about how someone is making their own set of observations, and, full credit, thinking outside the box, thinking creatively, thinking in a different way, sure, that stuff is all awesome most of the time, but just because you've arranged a set of facts in a way that makes sense to you does not mean that your conclusion will be correct. It also does not mean that this person was the killer. Okay, you see the letters S and S here. You're looking at the hooded costume of the Zodiac. That does not mean for a second that the Zodiac killer was a KKK member and a neo-Nazi. So both of these types of methods are just highlighting how impractical they are. Follow up to that question, what should a newcomer do to a high-profile true crime case like Jack the Ripper or even the Zodiac killer? Look at the established suspects. And if you can find something wrong with all of them, then perhaps conduct your own investigation and look at a unified theory. But really, why should somebody start building their own unified theory on day one? And I hope I don't sound like I'm angry or anything. These are challenge questions that I'm genuinely exploring and giving my honest answers to. But why should somebody solve the case with their own unified theory on day one? Where it would be like, all right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to list out what I know about Jack the Ripper, and I'm going to find a suspect. Let's see, why don't I just flip through some record books from England in 1888? And we've had we've butchers and so on, maybe a baker or a candlestick maker now. Let's take the candlestick maker. All right, this person was 30 years old, lived in England. He was a candlestick maker. He's my Jack the Ripper suspect. then they're just going to find supporting reasons why this 30-year-old candlestick maker was Jack the Ripper. Patterns seeking to get a desired result. That's what that's going to turn into, and that has no relevance on the outcome. Okay, so that's one challenge question. Here's another one that I thought was pretty good from the Ripper cast. And they were again asking this to Stan Russo. And ultimately, he agreed with my first assessment. I gave my purely own response, but he's like, yes, look at the established suspects. Now, this next challenge question that was asked on the Ripper cast was, is the motive more important than the killer's identity? And the reason why they asked this was Stan Russo had been interviewed for his book by somebody else, and he said that the motive for a serial killer to operate is more important than the identity of the serial killer. And I was like, that's a really bizarre statement, and I'm going to share with you guys my pure thought process on this. At first, I was like, no, absolutely, the motive is not more important than the identity of the killer. I first heard this quotation from John Lorden, who created the Lorden Arts channel. He was a very big influence on me as a true crime follower. I used to watch his episodes every single day, and what John Lorden stated was that sometimes you will get some answers to a mystery. You will know the identity of the culprit, but you won't know anything else. You won't know why they did it. You won't know what they were thinking. You won't know any of the additional details. And you just have to accept that. Sometimes this person was indeed the killer, but you have no idea why they did it. What drove them to commit these crimes? You aren't going to get answers to those types of questions, but you will still know who the killer was. People are even exploring some of this right now with the Idaho 4 case, although with the Idaho 4 murders and Brian Koberger, a lot of people are reasonably certain they know why he did it, but he hasn't revealed it publicly. Yet at the same time, they know who the killer was. We're talking DNA evidence, whereabouts, being caught on camera, and entering a guilty plea. So ultimately, you can learn who the killer was without knowing the motive. But Stan Russo did give a rather interesting explanation was when he was saying that if you know the motive, then you can start creating suspect profiles that would fit in with the motive. For example, if you have a suspect, well, let's just look at the motive. What would be the motive for Jack the Ripper? To mutilate women. Well, why does he want to mutilate and murder women? Because he has an intense animosity toward women and, well, who's going to be easily available? Women who are out on the streets late at night. Okay, so if we put all of this in order, then it seems like we have some reasonable things that we can look at in regards to Jack the Ripper. Maybe suspects who are homosexual should fall a little bit lower on the list. Maybe suspects who are going to be roaming the streets of Whitechapel should be higher on the list, and the ones who did not live in Whitechapel can go lower on the list. And do you know who was a big believer in that? John Douglas in his book The Cases That Haunt Us. One thing that I did not mention in the From Hell discussion was a reason why that the From Hell letter could have been mailed to George Lusk, the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, as opposed to the Central News Agency, was that this person felt more comfortable mailing it to someone in Whitechapel. Again, John Douglas is of the belief that the Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jackie postcard are not from the killer. The From Hell letter most likely was. So he mailed it to someone who was in Whitechapel because Jack the Ripper lived in Whitechapel. He had spent years in Whitechapel, and that's just his thought process. So I completely understand what Stan Russo was saying about knowing the motive is very valuable. At the same time, I have to go with John Lorden. Sometimes you'll know the identity of the killer, and you won't know anything else. And right now, I'm going to play something for you guys, because I'm trying to make the Ripper Wednesday episodes more dynamic and have some different types of material. And I found an interview that was done on Late Night Pacific Northwest. That's the name of the channel. Their guest on the program was named James Simpson. And at first, he was talking about the Zodiac killer. As you guys know, I listen to a lot of content about the Zodiac. And they were talking about the Zodiac Ripper parallels. And I'm like, bring it on. You know that as well, that anything Ripper-related, Zodiac-related is up my alley. But they actually began to take this conversation completely into the realm of Jack the Ripper. I'm going to play the clip, and it's about 5 minutes long, and then let's respond.
I always found the similarities the way the Zodiac communicated with the public very eerily similar, and like some kind of I would just say emulation of Jack the Ripper, the way he terrorized Whitechapel during his reign.
It is true. Yeah, it is very true.
I thought he was probably trying to mimic him in such a way where he was trying to terrorize, to build that fear, to try to accomplish some kind of maybe some small political point, some ends, but it was never really figured out, back then. And I always found the Zodiac amazing in the fact that he was able to grip, and capture the whole state of California's, their mind.
Well, wasn't the Jack the Ripper whole deal too? They never really caught him either.
Well,
and so they're claiming it was more than one person, like the same concept with the Zodiac.
Yeah, they just recently said, but it was less than a month ago, they they tested some DNA that was left at the crime scene in one of the Whitechapel murders, and they got it down to one suspect. That the number one suspect, it was some Polish immigrant who was operating a barbershop on the West End. He was, I believe, he wore a leather apron, and he had some knowledge of butchery.
But then how reliable is that? Because some people thought it was H.H. Holmes as well. So
yeah, but that's 130 years of difference, or 120 years of difference with DNA testing. So who knows?
Yeah.
But the way it is Zodiac.
My favorite theory on that is not to interject, but my favorite theory on that is that the queen had a prince that was part of her court who was kind of, had a strong sexual appetite, and
yeah.
I was reading a bunch of articles that just kind of dated back to the discussion of this gentleman being, out and about and dating prostitutes, meeting call girls and stuff, and that, apparently that he was getting them pregnant, and that the queen's doctor was kind of pulled into the whole affair and was told to go out and, do what he did and kill the women so that way the children couldn't be born and ruin the monarchy of Queen Victoria. And this is kind of the strange darkness behind the store Victoria's Secret. That movie or that store. Have you heard that franchise before?
Of course, yeah. Anybody has?
So it's like, hey, we all know what's behind a girl's underwear. What is Victoria's Secret? And it turns out that that's kind of got like a little dark humor built into it, and cryptic marketing is that way. But
that does make sense, though.
Well, I mean, you just find out that the man, used a certain kind of coding. It was a Persher coding, which means certain elements of the letter itself would show his degree of education. And that was the original kind of profiling that they have. He was a very educated man. So I don't really know if I can dive into the theory of him being a butcher so much, other than the fact that he was an allopathic doctor when he went out and butchered the women. But he was kind of, back in the day, they couldn't really perform abortions. And I think one of the victims had kind of been, like, the body had been desecrated in a certain way, so as to have exposed the fact that she was pregnant, right? But I think the strange thing was how was the doctor going to know she was pregnant? That sort of thing. If he wasn't
Probably from the monarchy.
Right. Well, I mean, the thing is in the actual cipher itself, it showed that he was of a Masonic order. It showed that he used the base level system for hints and for guides that were developed from the at that time were basically used by the Masons. And that was a pretty tight order back then. I mean, it wasn't like everybody there was so much segregation, who was educated, that they could easily keep all that stuff together. But now, now there's so many documentaries about it, you really don't ever get.
And one more time, that was from the channel Late Night Pacific Northwest. And as you can see, that was a fairly elementary discussion on Jack the Ripper. And I only wanted to share this because some things caught my attention, of course, and you guys who have followed the Ripper case longer than I have will already be very keen to point out some issues with that statement there. And firstly, that clip was actually uploaded to YouTube 6 years ago, but this whole thing about the DNA evidence in the Ripper case and how there's all of a sudden, a few months ago, there was this DNA link to a Ripper suspect named Aaron Kosminski. You could have played that in 2025, and it would still be relevant. From time to time, that news story comes up about how there is this DNA link, and it's not 6 years old, it's at least 11 years old now at the time of this recording, about Russell Edwards and his book Naming Jack the Ripper, and ultimately, we are still at the same place where we were 11 years ago with just some unreliable DNA evidence. I was also very surprised that they immediately wanted to go to the multiple killers theory, or think that the multiple killers theory is something that should be as widely discussed in the Ripper case as they would like, because definitely I find in the Ripper case people are leaning more toward a single killer, and yes, there are multiple killers variants in the Jack the Ripper case, but the single killer theory, I think, is absolutely more prevalent. And the case examples that I've talked about in this episode have also been leaning more toward a single killer. A single killer, but somebody like John Douglas would say one killer, but multiple letter writers, the From Hell letter and the other communications not being written by the same person. And I also think that that's a reasonable conclusion. And let's not forget that there were more than 1,000 Jack the Ripper letters. It's just that most of them are not taken seriously, and most of them were not considered authentic communications. I don't think there's any way that one person wrote 1,000 letters. Even Patricia Cornwell, who thinks that hundreds of letters were written by the killer, estimates that around 200 were written by her suspect, Walter Sickert. And I do mean that. She did go on the record saying that. I don't know what she thinks now, but she has other things to do, so maybe she stepped back from the world of Jack the Ripper. Now, these other things, though, in that episode, they were talking about how they believe that Aaron Kosminski is a very strong suspect, but it seemed like they were purely conflating Aaron Kosminski with the Jack the Ripper suspect John Pizer, who was known as Leather Apron, saying that Kosminski ran a barber shop and that he wore the leather apron and he had a background in butchering. Well, it's like you've just combined a bunch of Jack the Ripper suspects there. Now, Leather Apron is John Pizer. He was a suspect who was on the radar, and he is the famous Leather Apron. Aaron Kosminski was the Polish immigrant, as they call him, and he was someone who came to England when he was 16 years old. Now, they talked about him running a barber shop. It was my understanding, during Aaron Kosminski's adult years, he was actually unemployed for a very long time. Even though he was a trained barber and hairdresser, he was unemployed for a lot of it. And then, of course, he's going to deteriorate and end up eating food out of the gutter and refusing to bathe. So those are just some things that caught my attention. If you have any other observations about that interview, and I'm not being overly harsh on them, that was a Zodiac killer interview where they decided to talk about Jack the Ripper for a little bit. It's just something that happened to be on my radar. But I would love to know your responses to Pacific Northwest Late Night, as well as your responses to those challenge questions. Should a newcomer to the Jack the Ripper case look at established suspects or make their own unified theory? And the other challenge question as well was that, is the motive more important than the murder? And do you have any responses to John Douglas and his observations about the From Hell letter? I would love to read them in the comments section down below. You guys know where to write the show, blackboxonlineradio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook name is Ned DeHaan. You also can use the Black Box Online Radio Facebook page, as well as BlackBoxNed88 on TikTok and Instagram. And on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, I release shorts Monday through Friday that are mostly talking about serial killers and true crime news. And if you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And I'll see you tomorrow for a bonus episode here on BBO War. Until next time.